Hey, good evening, everybody. This is Kevin at Fiveable, and I'm glad you're here tonight. I know that there are still some schools on spring break, but I'm glad that you are here with us through some rhetorical analysis review. Tonight, we're going to be focusing on a high-level reading, and then how do I put that into high-level writing of a rhetorical analysis prompt. Now, at this point in the year, it's April. Some of you might have seen some of the prompts that we use. Next week, I'm going to be doing a rhetorical analysis conclusion focused live session. And then we'll kind of start to wrap up for the year doing some reviews of everything to make sure we're really maximizing these last few sessions together leading up to the exam on May 15th. So again, tonight, next week, all about rhetorical analysis. And the reason for that, I've heard from some Fiveable members, and I just know most students that I talk to, that is the essay type that is most requested for review at this time of the year. But again, we'll focus on reviewing everything that you need to review between now and May 15th with the last several live sessions of the year. If you do miss any, make sure you feel free, if you're a Fiveable Plus member, to go back at any time to see any of the replays that you may watch. So this week, let's dive in with a very high level review. Let me switch this over, of rhetorical analysis. As always, if you have questions, please let me know. We'll make sure everyone's questions are answered tonight. If there's anything you want me to go in depth more or to explain more, please let me know. So I call this slide, Analyze the Mindset of the Audience. Every time you get a rhetorical analysis passage, read the top 1 or 2 sentences of context. That clues you in a little bit on who the audience is, because it will tell you what year, what general time frame the work was published. Once you identify when it was published, you're going to want to figure out who exactly is the primary audience and what does the primary audience most likely currently think about the topic at hand. Again, next week, we'll talk about effective conclusions. Hopefully you can come there. We actually had a question last week on the live session asking about effective conclusions. So I put together a PowerPoint presentation that we'll run through to look at how to effectively wrap up a rhetorical analysis essay. If you were with me in the fall, this was my first slide that we looked at. So I'm bringing it back. Let's just talk about it. Let's get in the right frame of mind for rhetorical analysis. Before I even read, as I'm about to read, I have to think about the rhetorical triangle. What's the subject? The top context will generally give you a clue of what the subject is. It'll tell you who the speaker is for sure. And then you've got to use some inference to say, okay, who is the primary targeted audience? And then I think of the relationships between the two. I have to think about all this. I'm not going to explain it a lot because we've talked about it throughout the year. But always keep this triangle in mind. What are the relationships between speaker subject, speaker audience, and audience subject? Here in a phrase is the task of rhetorical analysis. If you were with me last week, the next 3 slides will be the same. I just want to make sure if you were not with me, you got this really clear, succinct mindset before we get to practice. So the rhetorical analysis task is to identify and explain what is effective about a particular argument. So in order to do this, you must do the following. So first, you must identify the primary purpose. Most likely, like 90% of the time or more, or higher, you will not be told the primary purpose. You'll be told some context. You'll be told maybe the year of publication. You'll be told maybe what magazine or wherever the work was published. You might be told the subject or the topic even in those contexts, but you won't know exactly the purpose, most likely. So you might know the topic, but might not know the purpose. So as you're reading, identify what is the author's actual purpose here. And then kind of hand in hand, identify how the audience is impacted. In other words, how does the author, the speaker, make writing choices to impact his or her audience? You can't really answer that as effectively as you would unless you think about who the audience is. So you don't want to just talk generically about, well, this is important or this is effective because. You want to avoid that. You can get a 5 or even a 6 doing it that way. But to really open up those high-level scores of analysis, you must talk more explicitly about the audience. So this would shift the audience's mindset here, and here is why. So that's the last bullet point. How would this impact the intended or the primary audience? Last week's live session, again, if you missed it, I recommend going back, especially if tonight you're like, I want a little bit more practice that's similar. These two live sessions, last week's and tonight's, are structured pretty similarly to do some reps of high-level thinking and reading, and then how do we translate that into writing. So again, the audience-subject relationship, I think, is the most important piece or side of the rhetorical triangle. Because before you it's all about the audience. So before you even read, you start thinking, and then you keep thinking as you're reading. How or what does the audience probably believe about the subject before even hearing the speech or reading the work? And ultimately, it comes down to this. Every passage that you'll see has the author doing one of two things. And you've got to identify which it is. So the author is either reinforcing a belief in the audience, and you have to get in the audience's head, what do they believe? Or, and this is probably the more common one, the author is trying to change the mindset of the audience. It might be a combination of both, but it's important. You have to infer, you have to have some background knowledge about who is this audience. Don't make things up, but be confident in what you do know. Is the author likely trying to reinforce what the audience already believes? Or is the author trying to change their mindset? All right, I'm going to do this quickly because I took some time to do this last week. But I want to make sure we're all on the same page. How should I time my rhetorical analysis essay? If I have 40 minutes, I actually recommend spending the first 12, and that seems like a lot out of 40, reading, fully understanding the nuance of the text, thinking about who the audience, author, subject relationship, what all of those relationships are. Focus on, again, nuance. You're going to annotate, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then keeping the intended audience in mind, you're going to focus in on what is the writer's most effective writing choices. This is what our live session was all about last week. And tonight we'll talk about this at length as well. How do I choose what to write about? So that's what we're going to talk about. But tonight's going to be more of an audience focus than last week's live session. So we're kind of taking it up one last notch before we move on to conclusions. 6 minutes to write your intro. In the intro, provide context, emphasize what's going on in the world in regards to the subject at the time of the writing. So that's the context I want. That's the context that we would want to see. So 12 minutes to plan out your essay. Don't start writing your intro until you know what your body paragraphs are going to be about. So you have to identify what's the primary purpose and how does the author achieve his or her purpose. Then you may start writing. Don't take more than 6 minutes here, but take some time, have an effective intro that will allow yourself to stand out. All right, 18 minutes, so the majority of the time, to write 2 or 3 body paragraphs. Less is more here in terms of number of paragraphs, so quality over quantity. A lot of students, I actually recommend writing 2 body paragraphs instead of 3. That gives you time to really expound and explain on your analysis. And we'll talk again what that analysis should look like tonight. So again, 2 effective paragraphs are better than 3 decent ones or mediocre ones. And I also talked about this briefly last week. Make sure you have a method to your madness. Make sure you have a reason for why body paragraph 1 is first and your last body paragraph is last. Not just because it's what you thought of when you were writing first, but why. So plan it out. Why start where you start and go where you go. Just like I asked you to do with when you're analyzing the piece in front of you, you want to have a plan of attack for your own writing. And then 2 minutes to write a quick conclusion. Again, that's next week's live session. And then I always recommend spending 2 minutes to proofread and revise. And I've talked about that before if you've been with me. So in a nutshell, this is not the plan. It's just a possible plan for you. If you don't like this, if there's things that you know you need to tweak to make your life better, to make your essay more productive, obviously feel free to do that, but have a plan. So this would be my plan if I was writing. I want you to know what your plan is, and of course you can take mine. All right, how to annotate. We're not going to actually, so last week, our live session, I annotated exactly how I would annotate for rhetorical analysis. This week, I'm actually going to do it differently, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But when you annotate, so again, in the first 12 minutes, you're reading, you're annotating, you're planning your essay. First, underline the most important phrases that just A, help you comprehend, and B, they help you start to narrow down, here's what I actually might quote in my own writing. So if you only underline a few sentences in like the first half, those sentences will pop off the page, and maybe those are the quotable sentences. So in the margins, write the primary writing choice that's made. We'll talk about that tonight. We're going to bracket or chunk the text to recognize, okay, here's where the shifts occur, and therefore what's happening before the first shift, I'm going to write that in the margin. I'll talk very explicitly once we get going with the practice on what I mean by that. What does that actually look like? And then again, look for a logical pattern. So as I was just talking about, where do the shifts occur? How does the author track the argument from beginning to middle to end? That's how I'm annotating. That's what I'm looking for. Now we're going to practice with a different rhetorical analysis prompt from last week. So I've actually graded this prompt at the official AP reading, so I can talk about this at length. If there's any questions, please let me know. If there's anything I'm not covering and I'm going a little too quickly over and you want me to slow down on, please let me know. This is the background knowledge or the context that they provide. So let's read this, and then let's jump into the actual text. On the 10th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., labor union organizer and civil rights leader Cesar Chavez published an article in the magazine of a religious organization devoted to helping those in need. Read the following excerpt. That's an important thing to take note of because I know this is not an entire standalone work. So I just got to keep that in mind as I'm reading. So read the following excerpt from the article carefully, then in a well-written essay, analyze the rhetorical choices Chavez makes to develop his argument about nonviolent resistance. All right, so things that are popping off the page. Cesar Chavez, I may or may not know who he is. Just thinking about my own background knowledge, think about yours. Do we know him? But either way, we know this about him. He's a labor union organizer. He's a civil rights leader. Now, he was probably alive when Martin Luther King was alive because it's only 10 years after. And in fact, he's probably aligned with Martin Luther King. Before I read, these are just quick thoughts. Because he's writing this on the 10th anniversary. So clearly that's going to be an intentional publication date. And he's a civil rights leader. And I know that Martin Luther King was a reverend. So if Cesar Chavez is publishing in a religious organization, maybe they align with their religious values. And also I'm thinking here about the audience. This is probably a primarily religious audience. And the reason I know that is because of where it's published. Do I know for a fact that every person who read this at the time was religious? No, but I know that's his primary audience because that's where he published. So these are all quick thoughts that I'm thinking. Now I want you thinking very quickly, when was this published? Because usually they would tell us. Our clue is here, right? So if Martin Luther King was assassinated in the 60s, this was published in the 70s. So with that in mind, let's think about the audience. This is an American audience because these are Americans. So again, primary audience, I'm not saying everyone who reads the work, but I really want to realize he's writing to a primarily religious American audience in the 1970s. That's who I'm talking about when I'm analyzing this work. I'm not talking about us today, as even though we're reading it and could be impacted by his article, that's not who he primarily wrote it for. So a primarily religious audience in America in the 1970s. Let's go. I was even more specific, 1978. I also would think these people, they're primarily religious. They most likely care about those in need. That's all I'm thinking. Let's move. So today, I'm not going to underline. I'm not going to say here is my annotations in the margin. Instead, I'm just going to get a quick snapshot of mind. What would the audience be thinking while reading Cesar Chavez's article? So let's read on the left. This is his article. And then for each chunk of text, let's figure out What would the audience think? As you're reading and as you're annotating, I'm just lifting the annotations away today. These are thoughts that I want you to have. What would the audience be thinking about these words? All right, let's go ahead and read. Dr. King's entire life was an example of power that nonviolence brings to bear in the real world. It is an example that inspired much of the philosophy and strategy of the farm workers movement. This observance of Dr. King's death gives us the best possible opportunity to recall the principles with which our struggle has grown and matured. So from the first paragraph, I'm thinking, what would the audience think? Well, the audience, they're reading a primarily religious magazine. They would probably respect Dr. King. Again, this is only 10 years after his assassination. And by the way, at the time, in 1968, when he was assassinated, Dr. King was pretty well regarded and well respected. However, there was certainly a segment of the population who thought he was controversial and did not align with him. Now, today, in 2019, we almost universally respect and align ourselves with Dr. King's values. In 1968, it was a little bit more segregated in terms of their beliefs. In 1978, it's somewhere in the middle of 1968 and 2019. But even only after 10 years, a lot of people had moved to Dr. King's side. So just keeping that in mind. This was a pretty not controversial thing to respect Dr. Martin Luther King. Therefore, his audience would also probably agree, because they've heard it from Martin Luther King, that nonviolence is a good thing. But they might be saying, and I think the audience would be split here, some would be relatively familiar with the farm workers movement, and some would say, there's a farm workers movement. This was much less of a national movement than the civil rights movement that we know about in the 1960s that Dr. Martin Luther King led. So the farm workers movement is part of a civil rights movement. It's just a specific segment of it. It's looking for civil rights for the farm workers. Some of the audience members would be familiar with it. Some would be mildly familiar with it. And some would have never even heard of it before. So let's keep going. You just got to think about that before I really start to look for the trend. Again, what I'm going to be looking for, when I'm putting this together, is how does Cesar Chavez get in the head of the audience to either A, reinforce their beliefs, or B, change their mindset. So let's keep that in mind. I put 3 paragraphs on the same slide because they're short. Let's read the 3 paragraphs. Let's think about what the audience is thinking. So Chavez says, our conviction is that human life is a very special possession given by God to man, and that no one has the right to take it for any reason or for any cause, however just it may be. We are also convinced that nonviolence is more powerful than violence. Nonviolence supports you if you have a just and moral cause. Nonviolence provides the opportunity to stay on the offensive, and that is of crucial importance to win any contest. If we resort to violence, then one of 2 things will happen. Either the violence will be escalated and there will be many injuries and perhaps deaths on both sides, or there will be a total demoralization of the workers. So as I'm quickly reading these 3 paragraphs, I'm annotating, but this is what I'm thinking. This is at the forefront of my mind. What is the audience thinking about Chavez's words here? So they would agree that human life is God-given because this is a primarily religious audience. And of course, because we're in America in the 1970s, I'm thinking this is a primarily Christian audience. All right, the audience would agree with nonviolent principles, very similar to here. It's just another reinforcement. And they would not value violence. So is Chavez reinforcing a belief or changing their mindset here? Well, pretty much he's, in the first 4 paragraphs, reinforcing their already agreed upon beliefs. Chavez is aligning himself with his audience and Dr. Martin Luther King. Next paragraph's a little bit longer. Nonviolence has exactly the opposite effect. If, for every violent act committed against us, we respond with nonviolence, we attract people's support. We can gather the support of millions who have a conscience and would rather see a nonviolent resolution to problems. We are convinced that when people are faced with a direct appeal from the poor, struggling nonviolently against great odds, they will react positively. I'm going to read that again just to make sure we get this key idea, but I'm going to cut a couple phrases out. We are convinced that when people are faced with a direct appeal from the poor, they, the people, will react positively. All right, let's finish this. The American people and people everywhere still yearn for justice. It is to that yearning that we appeal. So he's using we. Again, I just said he's aligning himself with his audience. That's another way he's doing that. So what's the audience thinking? They're also yearning for justice. He's saying we yearn for justice, essentially. So they're like, yes, we agree. And they, again, feel very aligned with Chavez. Now we're going to pause. I've identified the shifts for us tonight. So this is like the first third of an essay. If I have 3 body paragraphs in my essay, I would chunk it to say, in the beginning, this is what Chavez is doing. So Chavez begins his article by aligning the primarily religious audience with him by focusing on the benefits of nonviolence. I'm going to read my topic sentence again because that's exactly what it is, and I want you to hear it as such. This is my first topic sentence of my first body paragraph. Chavez, so I always have the last name, I should have the audience, and I should have the writing strategy that I'm analyzing. So Chavez begins his article by aligning the primarily religious audience with him by focusing on the benefits of nonviolence. Here's a couple sentences from that body paragraph then. This is my high-level analysis. I'm not writing a whole body paragraph for these tonight. I'm just showing here's some thoughts that I'm having. So I'm taking all of my slides together and then I'm chunking them. So I've had 5 paragraphs so far. Let me go back. The trend is here. He's aligning himself in all 5 of these paragraphs. Now, I'm telling you, there's going to be a shift here in which he starts to move away from that, or he starts to do something a little bit differently. But right now, first 5 paragraphs, that's exactly what he's doing. So here's a couple sentences that would be my analysis in that first body paragraph. By appealing to his audience's religion and morals, Chavez is aligning his audience with his cause. That'd be in my body paragraph. Here's another one. Go back to that farm workers movement discussion that we had 5 minutes ago. Think about that and let's read. By mentioning the farm workers movement only once in the opening paragraphs, Chavez does not allow his audience to mentally check out from a cause they might know little about. So my phrasing says, yeah, maybe they do, maybe they don't. But he's not spending his time on the farm workers movement. He's spending his time aligning them. And then I would unpack even further in my body paragraph why Chavez would choose to start his essay or his article with aligning himself with his audience as opposed to like asking them to do something. Now let's see where he goes. But that's what the high level analysis is. 2 weeks ago, or last week actually, that's what we talked about. So we're not going to talk a ton tonight about the beginning, middle, and end. We'll talk about it a little bit because these things are absolutely intertwined. So tonight's focus is on the audience mindset, but I want you remembering last week's live session because it scaffolds to this one. Beginning, middle, and end. Why does Chavez begin by doing this? And let's see where he shifts. I'm going to take a quick pause to check that we're doing good. All right, again, if there's any questions, let me know before we're out of here tonight. So this begins part 2 of 3 parts. But if we are committed to nonviolence only as a strategy or tactic, then if it fails, our only alternative is to turn to violence. So we must balance the strategy with a clear understanding of what we're doing. However important the struggle is, and however much misery, poverty, and exploitation exist, we know that it cannot be more important than one human life. We work on the theory that men and women who are truly concerned about people are nonviolent by nature. These people become violent when the deep concern they have for people is frustrated, and when they are faced with seemingly insurmountable odds. So the audience is actually being encouraged to continue to act in a non-violent manner because of the need to maintain nonviolence. He's not really moved on. I've identified a shift here, but let's look at a little bit more to realize what is that shift. What's the overarching writing strategy here? It's not a huge shift because his audience would still generally agree with this. He's not like challenging them right now, right? He's still aligned. He's very much taken time to align himself. Let's see where he continues to go. We advocate, so again, he has that pronoun we, militant nonviolence as our means of achieving justice for our people. But we are not blind to the feelings of frustration, impatience, and anger, which see the inside every farm worker. The burdens of generations of poverty and powerlessness lie heavy in the fields of America. If we fail, there are those who will see violence as a shortcut to change. It is precisely to overcome these frustrations that we have involved masses of people in their own struggle throughout the movement. Freedom is best experienced through participation and self-determination, and free men and women instinctively prefer democratic change to any other means. So let's do a quick pause. Let's talk about the audience. So here they're talking, they're thinking, yeah, that sounds right. We have empathy for the poor and the powerless. I'm getting that from here. So yeah, we know this and we have empathy for it, or at least sympathy, right? We want to fight against poverty and powerlessness. And again, they might be unfamiliar with the farm workers movement. He mentions them again and kind of discusses them even further. Yeah, right here. This is again not a huge stray from the first few paragraphs, but there has certainly been a shift in this topic. Let's keep going and let's keep identifying what's the overarching trend of this middle section. Thus, demonstrations and marches, strikes and boycotts are not only weapons against the growers, but our way of avoiding the senseless violence that brings no honor to any class or community. The boycott, as Gandhi taught, is the most nearly perfect instrument of nonviolent change, allowing masses of people to participate actively in a cause. So quickly, what would the audience think? Yeah, Gandhi is not as close to their hearts as Martin Luther King, most likely, but they would still have respect for him. They would know about him, and they would agree with his values. Even if they don't have the exact same religion, they would agree with his values because they have shared values and morals. And then they would agree, because Gandhi agrees, and we know Martin Luther King agrees, that these these types of demonstrations have benefits. Marches, strikes, boycotts, demonstrations. Here's the next trend that we've identified then. The middle portion of the text. Here's my second topic sentence. Again, if I have 3 body paragraphs, this is how I'm splitting my 3 body paragraphs. This is my second topic sentence. Chavez discusses both the mindset and the method of effective nonviolent protest. I hope you saw that shift as I was doing. I was trying not to say too much. I wanted you to read this authentically. As he's writing further into this article, if we just go back and look for this trend, he's really talking a lot specifically about the values and the methodology of nonviolence. Here he's talking about literally the types of protest. Here he's talking about why they advocate for nonviolence and who needs help through nonviolent means. Here he's talking about, again, the details and the nuance of nonviolence. I think this is an important piece, this paragraph right here. When he acknowledges there are frustrations, impatience, and anger when the solution is long-lasting. So I want you to definitely pay attention to that. But again, the second writing choice, I would put this as my very clear, succinct topic sentence. Chavez, always have the author's last name, discusses both the mindset and the method of effective nonviolent protest. Now, you might even have a transition here saying after discussing blank or after aligning himself with his audience, comma. That would even be better probably. But the point being here, be short and succinct. Not necessarily short, but be very clear and succinct. I had a live session actually planned for in a few weeks where we'll talk about effective, precise word choice. It's not about being fancy. It's about being super clear and articulate with your ideas. Here's an example of high-level analysis from our second body paragraph. Having a sense of unity with Chavez, kind of what I was just talking about as a launching off point. Having a sense of unity with Chavez, the audience would be prone to agree with his ideology of nonviolent protest. So they already have a unity with him, a sense of unity with him from our first body paragraph. And then I would say, yeah, he builds off of that unity, and now he emphasizes the one value he wants to talk about the most, nonviolence. All right, let's finish this off. So we've got our third section. This is our final section of the excerpt of his article. Let's read. Let's think about the audience. Let's look at the final trend here. How does he choose to end this excerpt? When victory comes through violence, it is a victory with strings attached. Now, I hope if you read that sentence, you would identify, okay, we're starting to shift here. So I'd keep reading, but then I would identify the shifts as you're reading. So we just talked at length about nonviolence. Now he shifts to juxtapose it against violence or compare it to violence. Right here, if we beat the growers at the expense of violence, and remember, growers, he's referencing the farm workers movement throughout this text. So if we beat the growers at the expense of violence, victory would come at the expense of injury and perhaps death. Such a thing would have a tremendous impact on us. Still, us, the farm workers, Chavez, the audience, all have aligned values. We would lose regard for human beings. Then, the struggle would become a mechanical thing. When you lose your sense of life and justice, you lose your strength. The greater the oppression, the more leverage nonviolence holds. Violence does not work in the long run, and if it is temporarily successful, it replaces one violent form of power with another just as violent. People suffer from violence. Very clear paragraph, especially with that ending. The audience would say, yeah, that sounds right. We would agree that violence is bad, and you just laid out the reasons why. So again, pretty aligned throughout this passage. Examine history. Who gets killed in the case of violent revolution? The poor, the workers. The people of the land are the ones who give their bodies and don't really gain that much for it. We believe it is too big a price to pay for not getting anything. Those who espouse violence exploit people. To call men to arms with many promises, to ask them to give up their lives for a cause and then to not produce for them afterwards, is the most vicious type of oppression. His audience is saying, yeah, we don't want that. We have empathy for the poor. We have sympathy for the poor and the exploited. I would also say this. I'm just thinking in the back of my head, maybe in 1978, there were people who would have been on the side of, hey, if nonviolence isn't going to work, maybe we need to resort to violence. And the reason I'm thinking that is the last two paragraphs. He's going at quite the length to say this is why violence is bad. He's essentially addressing the counter argument here of people who would say, if nonviolence isn't going to work, let's go to violence. He's saying, hold on, violence is not worth it, even though it's frustrating that nonviolence isn't working. Go back to that sentence that I highlighted a few minutes ago, and I think past part one. When he talks about, in part one, about stay with me, we know that there are frustrations, etc., for nonviolence taking too long. Keep that in mind when he comes here. He's saying, yeah, I know that there are people who might advocate for violence, but let's remember why violence is not the answer. Let's keep reading. We know that most likely we are not going to do anything else the rest of our lives except build our union. For us, there is nowhere else to go. Although we would like to see victory come soon, we are willing to wait. In this sense, time is our ally. We learned many years ago that the rich may have money, but the poor have time. All right, so what would the audience think here? Well, they'd be encouraged to have patience, kind of the launching off point of what I just was talking about. So I started thinking about it here, that he's talking about time, and he's talking about let's have patience. Let's not rush into violence just because we're frustrated with nonviolence not working. Let's stick with the plan and let's keep with nonviolence. So if they were on the fence and wanted to go violent, he's getting them back on the right side of the fence. Let's stick with the nonviolent plan. And maybe he's saying, hey, he's not beating him over the head with the idea of the farm workers movement, but hey, I've informed you about it, he's thinking. Now you're welcome to join me in a nonviolent protest. So here's how he ends this excerpt. Chavez ends this passage by implicitly encouraging his audience to join the slow and steady nonviolent farm workers movement. And again, his audience are the people alive and in the world at the time of this writing, 1978, America. Let's read the topic sentence again. Let's look at some high-level analysis here. Chavez ends this passage by implicitly encouraging his audience to join the slow and steady nonviolent farm workers movement. Here's a sentence that would be in that paragraph. Because his audience would feel so aligned with Chavez at this point, so that's building off of sections 1 and 2, where he did focus on alignment. His use of we in the final paragraph implicitly invites them to join his cause. Now, I did this intentionally because you could also, absolutely, you might have expected me to say he discusses the perils of violence, and that's totally valid. I would only do this if I have a lot to say here. But if I'm going to use the pronoun we, which a lot of people, I've read essays, again, I read this for the actual scoring, and I've read it, I've used it in class. A lot of people talk about the pronoun we very effectively. But I would still put it in that beginning, middle, and end mindset. Yes, he uses we throughout, but track the text as we go. He uses we to align himself. I would talk about that, and then I would really unpack it here in the final section. He's implicitly inviting them to join his cause. And then I would unpack even below here, why did he choose to do that, and why did he choose to do that with his specific audience in mind? By that, I mean invite them implicitly as opposed to explicitly. Why didn't he just come out and say, I encourage you to help me fight nonviolently for these farm workers? Why did he focus his time and attention on nonviolence versus violence? And that's interesting, and you can unpack that. Now, don't hear me incorrectly. If you said what you probably expected me to say, he discusses the perils of violence. That's totally fine. But you're unpacking it in a very similar way. What does the audience believe? How is he reinforcing an idea or changing their mindset? That's what this is all about. Let's go to the primary purpose overall, now that we've read the whole work. You don't need this, you don't need to like write the primary purpose out, but you cannot start writing your essay unless you've identified the primary purpose. So here's how I've written it. Chavez sets out to highlight that even though it might take a lifetime to accomplish a movement's goals, nonviolence is always preferable to violence. Essentially, that's the key. More than the farm workers movement actually, right, was nonviolence versus violence. Clearly, nonviolence is the winner, according to Chavez. So let's track this one more time. That's actually my last thought here tonight. If there's any questions, if you want me to unpack anything, we certainly will. Here's my first topic sentence, my second, my third. Let's look at them one last time and look at the flow of the text, kind of thinking of last week's slides. So first, in the first chunk of text, the first chunk before the first major shift, Chavez begins his article by aligning the primarily religious audience with him by focusing on the benefits of nonviolence. Then, the middle chunk of text, they don't have to be broken into even thirds, they need to be broken into where the major shifts actually occur. Chavez discusses both the mindset and the method of effective nonviolent protest. And then finally, Chavez ends this passage by implicitly encouraging his audience to join the slow and steady nonviolent farm workers movement. Now, let's do one more thought If I only have time for 2 body paragraphs, again, that's what I recommend most students do actually. If you've never written a 6 at this point in the year, never try 3 body paragraphs again. 2 body paragraphs, do them well. Go back to a live session replay that I had in the fall on an effective rhetorical analysis body paragraph and start there. Or if you have written a 6 or even a 7, but you want to stick with a 2 paragraph plan, how do we make that happen? You're going to just chunk it a little bit differently. For here, I would chunk beginning middle into 1 because these are very similar, where he's aligning himself with their values. You could do it differently. For this exact prompt, that's how I would do it. So this would be merged into one nice, beautiful body paragraph, and I keep this one pretty similar to how it would look. Here's my point. Don't spend too much time here and here and not enough time here. You want to make sure you spend adequate time with this thought of aligning himself with his audience. All right. Our last reminders. It's all about the audience. If you've been writing rhetorical analysis passages talking all about the author and his or her work, I'm going to ask you to raise the rigor, raise your own expectations, because all of the slides that I have tonight of high-level analysis were focused on the audience. How is the author changing the audience's mind or reinforcing what they already believe? It's all about the audience. You've heard me say this all year. Fancy terminology is not needed. Go back to my topic sentences. It would be a lot weaker if all I said was Chavez uses juxtaposition. Chavez uses allusions to Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Let's take it up a notch from that. Third, tracking the text. This was last week's live session, and we kind of ended with that same thought tonight. Tracking the text from beginning, middle to end is an effective way to organize your analysis. In fact, it opens up doors to high level of analysis. I talked last week at length about not falling into the danger of summary. Let's just go back to this sentence. All of my sentences that focus on the audience are not summary focused. So the more you have of this, the more you know, okay, I'm not summarizing. All right, so it looks like I have no questions tonight. That's fine. Next week, we will be working on effective conclusions for rhetorical analysis essays. That should not be more than an hour, but I hope you can come back for that, just to kind of wrap up our rhetorical analysis mini review unit. After next week, again, up through May 15th, we are doing live sessions every Tuesday at 5 my time, 7 Eastern time on Tuesday nights. Make sure that you are feeling really good and ready for this exam. It's doable. You can get a 3, you can get a 4, you can even get a 5. So practice, practice, practice. That's how we get better on AP Lang and Comp. All right, everyone, have a good rest of the week, and I will see you next Tuesday.